I've spent the past 20 years doing that, helping teams of leaders of government, of business, of civil society, work together to solve their toughest social, political, and economic problems. I've done that work on problems related to health, nutrition, energy, environment, security, development, peace. And I've done it throughout the Americas, in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and Australia. The big benefit of doing one thing over and over for 20 years is you have lots of opportunity for trial and lots of opportunity for error, and so lots of opportunity for learning. When I started 20 years ago, I thought that the key to solving tough problems was being able to work with power. But I discovered I was wrong. Then I thought that the key to being able to solve tough problems was being able to work with love. But it turns out I was wrong again. And what I have learned is that the only way to solve tough problems is to be able to work with both power and love. And that this is true at all scales of social systems: the family, the organization, the community, the nation, globally. And that although working with both power and love is simple, it turns out that it's not easy. I first grasped this relationship between power and love in an extraordinary context 15 years ago in August 1998 in Guatemala. 2 years previously, in 1996, a peace treaty was signed in Guatemala that ended the longest and most brutal civil war in the Americas. 36 years, 200,000 people murdered, mostly by the state, 1 million people displaced out of a population of only 7 million. A peace treaty was signed, and Guatemalans started to work on how to rebuild their country, and in particular, how to re-knit a social fabric that had been torn apart. And one of the activities they undertake was a project that I got involved in as the facilitator, which was called Vision Guatemala. Vision Guatemala brought together leaders from all parts of Guatemalan society, the former guerrillas, the military, members of the cabinet, business leaders, young people, church leaders, indigenous leaders, to talk about what had gone on, what was going on, what could go on, and what they should do about it. If I think back to how I arrived there 15 years ago as a confident, energetic, ambitious young man, I think that the paradigm that was uppermost in my mind was an interest and an appreciation of power. And what I mean by power, the way I'm using this word in a very particular way, I'm using the definition of power given by the theologian Paul Tillich. Tillich said, "Power is the drive of everything living to realize itself with increasing intensity and extensity." And my own experience in business, in politics, in daily life was that this drive of everything living to realize itself was a creative force that made things happen. But as the Vision Guatemala conversations unfolded, here a dialogue about the most difficult aspects of the war between a former military chief, a former guerrilla, the cabinet secretary of peace, I came to understand that this same power, this drive to self-realization, had not only a generative creative side, but also had a degenerative destructive side. And if people are trying to realize themselves, do what they want, get what they want, but in a way that doesn't pay attention to or ignores the self-realization of others, the result is brutal and, in the Guatemalan case, genocidal. So I started to see that power had two sides. a very interesting thing happened on the first night of the first day of the first meeting of the Vision Guatemala team. We invited the team to tell stories about their own personal experience with what had happened in Guatemala. And one man, Ronald Orquieta, was working as a researcher on the war for the Catholic Archdiocese of Guatemala. And he told a story about having, in this job, gone to be an official observer at the exhumation of a mass grave. There were many such graves, particularly in indigenous villages, and as he was watching the earth being taken out of the grave, he noticed that at the bottom of the grave there were small bones. And he asked the forensics people, what happened here? Did people have their bones broken during the massacre? And they said, no, sir. This massacre involved a number of pregnant women, and what you are seeing are the bones of their fetuses. You can feel a bit the impact of this story even in this room. Maybe you can imagine it in a circle of 30 people, all of whom in one way or another had been involved in the events under discussion. The group was completely silent, and then we went on with our work. And over the years that followed, this Vision Guatemala team went on to do many things in Guatemala to rebuild and reknit the country. When a group of researchers from MIT interviewed members of the Vision Guatemala team about their experience, many of them pointed to this 5 minutes of silence as having been the moment where they really understood what they needed to do as a group, as a team, and that gave them the purposefulness to do what they went on to do over the years that followed. And one of them used a very particular word. He said, these 5 minutes were a period of communion. Now, to say something is a period of communion in a Catholic country doesn't mean a nice moment or a friendly moment. It means a moment of being one body. And I thought now I had it, that this was really the essence of solving tough problems, this recognition of being one body, the recognition of interconnection, of wholeness. And this corresponds to what Paul Tillich, the definition Paul Tillich gave of love. He said, love is the drive to unify the separated. Not to create unity, but to reveal the unity which is there. So now I thought I had it. That this really was it. 10 years later, I went back to Guatemala in 2008. I wanted to see my friends. We had a reunion of the team. Some things had gone very well in Guatemala. Some things had gone badly. The team was still very connected. And at the meeting, or when on that trip, I had lunch with a woman I admire very much, Clara Arenas, who is a leader of an important NGO movement in Guatemala. And when we sat down for lunch, she said, Adam, I know you were so taken by the dialogue, by the oneness, by the communion in Vision Guatemala. Do you know that last week my NGO movement took out a full-page advertisement in the Guatemala City newspaper saying we would no longer participate in any more dialogues? And of course, she knew I'd be interested. I said, why did you do that? And she said, well, our experience is that when we entered into dialogue with the government or with the big business, they expected that when we were participating in the dialogue, we would stop marching in the streets. We would demobilize. And our view was that if being in dialogue meant that we had to give up the little bit of power we had as a civil society movement, that is simply an unacceptable deal. So that's when I realized that love also has two sides. And it's at that point that I started to understand the mathematics of power and love. And it's really quite simple. What is it that makes power degenerative rather than generative. It is the absence of love. And what is it that makes love degenerative rather than generative? It is the absence of power. So power and love are not a choice. They are a dilemma or a polarity. And choosing either power or love is always a mistake. The person who put this most clearly is Paul Tillich's, or was Paul Tillich's most famous student, Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "Power without love is reckless and abusive. And love without power is sentimental and anemic. This clash between immoral power and powerless immorality is the central crisis of our time." So I first saw this in the extraordinary context of post-war Guatemala, but now I realize that this same phenomena plays out in all social scales: global, national, organizational, community, family. And if you want to see this most clearly, you just have to look at the historically constructed roles in the family. This was pointed out to me by a great feminist scholar from Milan, Paola Melchiori, who said to me that you can see the two sides of power and the two sides of love in such a family. The husband represents power, and the generative side of his power is that he goes out of the house in the morning to do his job, to make his contribution to the world, to create something in the world. The degenerative side of his power, which is the subject of 100 novels and 100 movies, is that he becomes so concerned with this thing he has to do, with his work, with his destiny, with his ambition, that he becomes a robot or a tyrant. But what I hadn't appreciated until Paola pointed it out to me is it's symmetrically true of the wife. The generative side of the wife's love is that she literally gives birth to the children, metaphorically to the family. The degenerative side of her love is that she becomes so concerned with protecting, with guaranteeing the unity of the family, that she undermines the power of the members of the family, and even more fundamentally, undermines her own power. So we can see in an everyday situation the two sides of power and the two sides of love. The great biography of Martin Luther King is named Taylor Branch, and when he was discussing this speech where King said, "Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic," he said that King's life can be understood as walking a narrow path, trying to avoid, on the one hand, reckless and abusive power without love, and on the other hand, sentimental and anemic love without power. And there is, of course, a famous story about such a narrow path, the story of Odysseus trying to sail through the Strait of Messina between these two monsters. On the rocks is Scylla, this seven-headed monster, and in the middle of the passage is Charybdis, this whirlpool. And the difficulty of sailing this narrow path is if he tries to avoid Charybdis, he risks falling into Scylla, and if he tries to avoid Scylla, he risks being devoured by Charybdis. And this is how I understand what is involved in trying to walk this narrow path. That if you find yourself in a situation or yourself exhibiting reckless and abusive power without love, what's needed is to reinforce the love side. And when you find yourself falling into a sentimental and anemic love without power, what's needed is to reinforce the power side. So, this is what I have learned. Working with both power and love is simple, but it's not easy. Working with power and love requires each of us to stretch beyond our comfort zone, and in particular, for the people who are most comfortable and confident with power, to work on strengthening their capacity for love, and for the people who are most comfortable and capable in love, to work on strengthening their capacity for power. And it is only when we can work with both power and love that we can solve our tough problems. The image which the Jungian psychologist Robert Johnson offers is that if we can develop these two sides of ourselves, this capacity for power and this capacity for love, they will gradually interpenetrate within us. That it's not actually about finding a balanced place in the middle, it's about working on each of them and letting them grow together. And he refers to this growing together using the Italian word for the shape, the almond shape at the intersection of two circles, the mandorla. And it is so only by developing this mandorla in ourselves, in our social systems, that we can succeed in solving our toughest problems. Thank you very much.